So we are here with Inspector Kevin Mahar, and you kind of oversee this whole day today. Can you tell us what happened here?
So today was a culmination of about 10 months of preparation within the Halton Regional Police Service. We've had a large-scale working group within the organization that's comprised of our training branch, our operations branch, human resources, our legal services, a number of different areas. And as well, there's been subcommittees of that main group. We've been collaborating with our municipal partners in the enforcement area. We've been collaborating with the health department from the region to really prepare Halton Region and the residents of Halton Region for cannabis legalization on October 17th. So today was a media event, and it was an opportunity for us to deliver three key strategic messages that we want to share with the community regarding the legalization, which will take place on October 17th.
And so what were those three key messages?
So the three key messages, the first one was that there will be a period of social adjustment post-October 17th. When legalization occurs and it becomes legal to consume it, we're asking folks in our communities, regardless of whether you are going to be a consumer of cannabis or whether you're going to be a non-consumer of cannabis, we're asking you to respect one another and respect each other's rights and open up some dialogue with each other. If you are a consumer and you're going to be consuming cannabis, we want you to be mindful of the fact that smoke and the odor does travel, and be respectful of your neighbors on either side. And if you're a non-consumer and you do have a neighbor that that is in some fashion perhaps consuming in a way that's interfering, then take that opportunity to have some respectful dialogue around it and try to find some common ground. If need be, and ask another fellow neighbor who maybe could be a mediator for you. And in a worst case scenario, there are non-for-profit mediation organizations in our community that would also help in having that dialogue. The second message is in regards to the fact that once cannabis does become legalized, it is going to be very heavily regulated and controlled. It will be legal for an adult, 19 or older, to possess up to 30 grams of dried cannabis. And it will also be legal for them for one household, so to cultivate and grow up to 4 plants per household. But the most important thing to remember is that the consumption will only be able to be lawfully done at or in a private residence. So it will not be lawful to consume it in a park, in a public setting, in a mall, walking down the street. So it's important for those folks that are going to be consumers to educate themselves on the law so that they are adhering to the new legislation.
Do you think that will ever change about the you can only consume in private areas? Do you think there could be certain events or establishments that could get, like how there's a liquor license, that events or establishments could get a cannabis license?
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's a very good concept. That would probably be something that will fall under provincial legislation in the future. And I do believe the provincial government is researching some of those next steps. A licensed establishment that would permit cannabis consumption is, although I don't know if it's coming, it is not out of the realm of possibility. One can imagine it being down the road in the future, something that would be permitted. So yeah, I do see potentially down the road future changes in legislation.
And the third point.
The third point. That's okay. The third point is obviously probably our most important point today, and that's the area around road safety. We wanted to make it clear that the Halton Regional Police Service has officers trained, some specialized, and some even just our general patrol officers are trained to investigate, detect, investigate, and prosecute individuals who are impaired by cannabis and or impaired by alcohol. That training has been in place for quite a while. We have been ready for this for quite a while. We've been already prosecuting folks that are impaired by drug even prior to now, have been for quite a while, and we will continue to train and develop our officers' skills in that area. There's been a lot of conversation in the media around the Draeger saliva test device. We are going to be purchasing one unit for field operations.
Only one unit?
At this time, we're only purchasing one.
For all of Halton Region?
For all of Halton Region. It's going to be field tested initially. We may get additional units down the road. but we're going to start with one, and it is going to be used at this point for novice and commercial driver enforcement. So both of those groups have to, by law, conform to a zero presence of cannabis in their blood while driving. So that tool will be utilized for those special enforcement strategies. Roadside checks, random traffic stops, and most importantly as well, commercial motor vehicle blitzes, which we conduct, where we will focus on roadside checks on commercial motor vehicles. That device will be utilized at those events as well. We will evaluate the device, its usefulness, and in the future evaluate whether we need to get more and deploy them. But the backbone of our strategy to detect, investigate, and prosecute impaired driving by drug and alcohol is our officers. It's their skilled in investigations, detecting, observing, noting, and then lawfully proceeding with additional tests if there's signs of impairment as they go.
So for impairment by cannabis while driving, is this something that you've just recently started testing for, or is this something that it's always been tested for under the umbrella of impairment?
It's a great question, and that's a really important message that we're going to say today, or that we did say today, is that we've been doing this for quite a while. We have officers trained in SFST, which stands for essentially it's a field sobriety test, specialized. Those officers can investigate a suspected impaired by drug officer. If the grounds exist for an arrest, at that point, then what's called a drug recognition officer, a specialized officer who's received substantial training, is called in to conduct a more comprehensive test. And it's that drug recognition officer's evidence that could lead to someone being charged with being impaired by drug and driving. And it's that evidence from that test that would be administered in a court, and ultimately would be up to a judge to determine if that individual was in fact impaired based on the observations of that officer, the drug recognition officer. There is a whole other investigative stream involving blood demands and making a blood demand. That's not an area that I'm an expert in. We do have someone here with us this morning, Sergeant Snow, who provides some really detailed answers on that, but that is the straightforward answer is that yes, we have been doing it. We have been charging people with impaired by drug for quite some time, for many, many, many years. More recently, we've been investing as an organization in the training and increasing the number of individual officers we have that have those skills, so that we can be prepared for cannabis legalization.
So after the social adjustment period, as you put it, because I assume probably the people who are going to be most impaired are going to be the people who are trying cannabis for the first time now
Yes.
that it is legal, right? But after that period subsides, then what do you think there will be an increase in the number of people impaired by cannabis while driving, or
It's a very good question.
Increase,
We are optimistic or hopeful that the messaging that we are doing today will help prevent that from happening, but we're also prepared that there could be an increase. If we see, if there is an increase in the consumption, it wouldn't be illogical to assume that will lead to people making those bad decisions in driving. We're prepared for that. That's what we're preparing for. We hope that we don't see that. We hope that folks will consume it in a respectful manner and recognize in their own self that they are impaired and not drive and not choose to operate. But as we've noticed with alcohol, people will make that bad decision, and when they do, we'll be there prepared to intervene and investigate. We've also, as always, encouraged residents, if they see someone operating a motor vehicle on the roadway that they believe to be impaired, it's not their job to investigate it. It's not their job to follow the car. It's not their job to even know which type of impairment it may be, but we do ask them and encourage them to call the police. That's a crime in progress. They can call 911 and indicate that I've got an impaired driver behind me, beside me, in front of me. Try to get a description of the vehicle and the license plate, and then the direction of travel. But then that's all we ask them to do. But a significant percentage, I believe Sergeant Snow said this morning, 33% of our impaired prosecutions, whether it be by drug or alcohol, stem from a citizen calling in and saying that they're seeing someone dangerously driving down the road. That's where the, over a third of our investigations start.
What's the other 66% ride programs?
A portion would be ride checks, and then the other portion would just be officer observations. So an officer on patrol will see something and investigate it, and that will lead to a prosecution. So
okay, and then so I guess final question. So with this coming, your experience as an officer, have you had more issues over your years with alcohol or cannabis?
That's a very good question.
Now being the two grandfathered in drugs.
It's a very good question. I've been a police officer for quite some time, for over 30 years. I would say that, alcohol, being that it's been a legal substance as long as I've been a police officer, has always been a source of negative impact on behaviors, whether it be driving or other behaviors. So I've always seen that. I think that's remained fairly steady over my career. I will say that I think cannabis, in my opinion, has increased in I guess, I don't know if you want to say popularity or social acceptance. So I think cannabis has been slowly increasing in terms of the amount of consumption. So as my career has gone on, I think cannabis has been more. We've had more interaction with individuals that have been consuming it, and I think that is also reflective in the fact that the federal government has chosen to take this route. One of the reasons they've chosen to take this route.
But on an average rate, are those interactions with someone on cannabis more negative or more positive than someone compared to on alcohol? I know it varies.
Yeah, it varies. It's a tricky question for me because I have not been in a patrol function for quite a while.
Oh, okay.
So.
Like violent crimes, for example.
Yeah,
who's more likely to be violent?
Let me answer your question this way by saying I can't recall someone under the influence of cannabis acting violently in my career. I have encountered people that alcohol has led to violence, but that's just my personal observations. I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but I can't recall someone specifically that I saw that had cannabis and that reacted in a violent manner.
Cool. And maybe one more. Do you know, are any officers planning to partake in cannabis, and is there any rules around that?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. We have not yet finalized our internal policy as an organization, but what it will look like, or what its overarching theme is going to be, that we expect and we demand all our employees, and particularly those in safety-sensitive roles, such as frontline police officers, to be fit for duty. That is going to be our overarching theme of our internal policy, and we are going to educate our employees, both sworn and non-sworn, about the effects of cannabis, because up until October 17th, it hasn't been a lawful act to consume, so our police officers haven't been in a position to do so lawfully. If they so choose to become consumers, it is our responsibility as employers to educate them so that they're aware of what the effects may be, but also our expectations that they will arrive for their duties without any influence from any substance, be it cannabis or alcohol or otherwise.
Is that how you define fit for duty?
Yeah, it is.
Nothing.
It's a tricky thing, because as we spoke about earlier, and Dr. McGanny referenced the 6-hour rule for cannabis, it isn't a rule. In fact, it's a guideline. Those same guidelines apply to alcohol, right? There is a period of time when alcohol in the body is metabolized and the effects dissipate. It's different for every individual, right? So depending on your weight, your size, what you've had to eat, what you've had to consume, in addition to if you're mixing different substances, all those things are factors. But what we're saying to those folks is, if you're showing up for duty, we expect you to be just that, fit for duty in all aspects, because it's obviously a safety-sensitive role.
And do officers go drug testing?
No, we do not have any drug testing.
Not even at the beginning?
No.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well.
Awesome. Thank you.
If somebody has a medical marijuana license, how do you permit them to exercise their right to consume marijuana? But if you're working in an area or an occupation that has a level of risk or maybe safety attached to it, you have to think of it from a police perspective. We can't put someone with a medical marijuana license that's consuming into a marked police vehicle and say, go on out and do your job. So we're going to have to accommodate them and put them into a position where we can respect and accommodate their needs, but ultimately it doesn't put themselves or the community in danger.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a number of different parts to that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So, and then how would then with a medical marijuana patient, how would you determine impairment? Because they could be using levels that are a lot higher than the
Certainly.
average person,
Yeah, they
right?
could.
But, and experiencing much less
Yep.
impairment, right?
Well, you know what? It's a really, really interesting question because ultimately it always goes back to the user. So the easiest way to put it for starters is that even people that are medical marijuana users can't compromise traffic safety, okay, as a whole. So when you're driving, even if you have a medical marijuana license, you need to ensure that you're in compliance with the criminal code. So where you may have a pass, say for instance, if you're a young novice or commercial driver, you may have a pass on that piece of the legislation under the Highway Traffic Act, you still need to comply with what the criminal code says. So if you end up getting into that prohibited area of THC concentration, you don't get a pass for that simply because you have a medical marijuana license.
And so that's 2 nanograms?
2 nanograms in the blood. And that's an important piece to note here, right? Because what the criminal code says is it's blood drug concentration. It's nothing to do with saliva. It's what's in your blood.
And so how long does that stay in your system for one? Like I know.
Up to a month.
Yeah, is it blood up to a month as well?
Well, you know, there's a couple of different
I know
parts
for
to
urine
it.
it's up to a month, or it can even be like 2 or 3 months,
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
Oh, there's my ride.
There's your ride.
Thank you very
Have
much.
a good day.
Take care.
There's probably other folks that are a little bit more trained in that area than I am, but here's what I can tell you. Alcohol
It's 24 hours.
is stored in water.
Yeah.
THC stored in fat. Another part of why persons of different body types and body builds are going to process and react to it differently. So keep in mind as well, though, that when we're talking about drug in blood, we're not talking about the metabolites of the drug. So you could ultimately end up having the metabolites in your blood, but that's not actually a criminal offense, right? It's about the drug itself. So again, very, very hard to predict how long you would potentially have that magic number in your system, but that's why we always start off with the impairment piece, because what we do know is the impairment will generally last longer than the prohibited amount in your system. So you will likely...
Do you think so?
Yes.
I think it would be the reverse, wouldn't it?
Oh.
If it stores in your fat.
Well, if it stores
then
in your fat, doesn't mean it's in your blood, right?
Yeah.
So again, you have to remember, I mean, with that whole talk
Okay.
about that P-test piece, there are some jobs that actually require that.
Yeah.
You know, again, for those folks, yeah, I understand. From what I believe to be the case, these folks sometimes get a little bit nervous, perhaps, if they're consuming marijuana in a job where they're not permitted to do so. So again, that's urine. However, in the blood, again, not being an expert specifically on that, but what I can certainly tell you is that the blood drug concentration will drop fairly quickly for marijuana. It will still be there. There will be other ways to test for that presence of the drug in your body. But again, it all depends on how much you're consuming. But ultimately, if we were to, for instance, test you 12 hours after consuming, if you only had, for instance, maybe a half a gram or the equivalent of a joint, you're not going to end up hitting that minimum standard of 2 nanograms 12 hours after the fact. You're just not.
What if it's super potent?
Well, then you get into that situation where, yes, again, that impairment may change. But yeah,
Refined oil, whatever.
yeah,
you know.
yeah. You know, now you end up with a lot of different factors, which goes back to that very hard to predict what impairment is going to look like, because it's based on tolerance of the user, purity of the product, how much you used, how long ago you used it, did you mix it with other things, did you ingest other drugs when you were doing marijuana, which as I understand is commonly something that occurs. If you then also mix alcohol with it, alcohol and marijuana have a tendency to magnify the effects that are outwardly seen by others. So there's a whole bunch of different things that if you do, ultimately could increase that level of impairment. And that's different than alcohol, right? Whether or not you consume spirits, liquor, spirits, wine, or beer, alcohol is alcohol, right? And we know what alcohol looks like, and you can transition between those three classes of liquor, and it's not an issue. But when you come on over into the drug piece, being able to go and define what you should expect to see is a completely different ballgame altogether.
Well, it is. Well, I think it is for each drug.
Yep.
Right. Probably for each drug.
Sure.
But yeah, I'm just wondering about the length that 2 nanograms is going to stay in the blood. I don't know related to blood. I know
ultimately it will be
urine,
different.
It stays in there long.
Yep.
I know for hair it stays in there long.
Ultimately, you'll find that it's going to be different for different users, and that's really the piece that's important, that we're consistent on that. You know, and again, that's from a policing and from a media standpoint, because the one thing I would not want to see is for youth who perhaps consumes marijuana to actually think that there's a magic number. I can consume this much. That would be like me saying you can consume 2 beers but not 3 and then drive. Same thing with marijuana, and that's why we say if you're going to do so safely. But we don't want anyone really to put a number to it and say, if you wait this long, you're going to be good to go. Because basically at the end of the day, drugs and alcohol and driving just don't mix.
So then what is, to anybody out there who watches this, what is your recommended wait time to someone if you were to smoke a joint or
well, you know what?
Edible? Well, edibles also becoming legal? Or is...
Well, my understanding is that the government as a whole is going to wait a year in order to look at implementing legislation around edibles. Right now, edibles are not part of the current legislation. My understanding is they're going to wait at least a year before actually working on that piece. Okay. So, you know, what do you say to people? Okay, be it for me, in order to provide your viewers with an idea of what that wait time would be. Dr. McGanny, the medical officer of health for the region of Halton, has talked about a guideline for THC being 6 hours. I think what she's saying is reasonable. I would probably temper that, however, by saying that, you know, again, it's going to manifest itself differently in different people, and ultimately, while that 6 hours is a great guideline, it may be longer for you. And if it is longer for you, the thing that you need to appreciate is, as a driver, you can't say, I consumed X amount of grams of THC, I waited 6 hours, ergo I'm good to drive. That's not what the criminal code says. If I stop you and you're impaired, I'm going to arrest you for impaired. If I believe that there is drugs in your body, I will then take you down that testing route, and ultimately the number is the number.
So I'm Sergeant Greg Brill with the Halton Regional Police. On October 17th, it won't be as if the Halton Regional Police will be flipping a switch and will be enforcing cannabis at a much stricter rate. Over the years, not only in the drug unit, but as well as the uniform patrol, I've seen stats that have shown a clear decline in the prosecution of cannabis. There's been in my opinion, a social change towards it and the opinions around it, and has been reflected within our actions in the police service. So, in my opinion, I think there are much more dangerous substances out there, and within Halton, I would go as far as to say that we are as well dealing with not necessarily as dangerous and as an epidemic as is happening in British Columbia, but there is a opioid crisis within Halton. I think that will be the main focus of drug enforcement. However, we're not going to turn a blind eye to criminal elements and criminal aspects behind cannabis. It is our hope that parties will abide by the legislation that's been provided by the government, and as the Halton Regional Police, we are responsible for enforcing that.
And so, what do you think will happen with the criminal element after?
Yeah. So again, when they drafted this legislation, they were pretty strict and they were pretty stringent to include the criminal element. So, as I said earlier, they provided more teeth and more powers, as well as stricter sentencing for which includes imprisonment as well as fines for criminal elements involved in this. So spade to spade, I don't think we'll ever see it completely go away. However, I do think that since it is easier for the public to gain lawful access, as well as the ability to cultivate their own product as well, I think that it will have the desired effects, and it will in fact minimize. But truthfully, I don't think we'll ever get rid of criminal aspects in any substance within Canada.
And so with it then becoming legal, do you then think that will at least eliminate a good chunk of the black market for that? And then if that is eliminated, then do you think the black market will then flood to other substances, or?
I don't want to speculate too much, but I think it's definitely possible. Again, now that residents and the population is allowed to gain lawful access to cannabis, I think that they would prefer to do that because it will be controlled, it will be prescribed within the now criminal code that you are allowed to go to an Ontario cannabis store and you are legally allowed to purchase. So I think many residents will be comfortable with that. Just if you think of alcohol, residents are still allowed to produce alcohol on their own, and some do decide to do that, some do make their own wine and that, but for the majority, people still use the legal channels and go to our beer stores and LCBO. So I can't speculate whether it will get rid of them or not. However, I do think that was their intent in doing this, and I think that residents will go to Ontario cannabis stores for their supply.
And so, with your knowledge and background in the drugs and gangs unit and whatever, what do you think will be the bigger problem for police? Do you think it will be people calling their neighbors and saying, I smell cannabis, and,
Sure.
Get over here, or do you think it will be the actual cannabis users themselves? What are you more worried about?
Personally, I think that I myself am more worried about the desired effects that, once again, so it would be to combat the illicit market, the black market, as well as keeping it out of the hands of our youth.
Mm-hmm.
So with that being said, consumption and public consumption, in the priority of things, it may not be necessarily the highest priority.
Mm-hmm.
And in your question, you asked whether it be the user or not. So in my opinion, I think there will be lawful consumption as well as unlawful consumption, but there's also public consumption of alcohol, which, if you look at the broad scheme of policing, it's not necessarily our highest priority. However, I think where we're going to focus the most is keeping it out of the hands of our youth, combating the illicit market, and as well as public safety in terms of operating a motor vehicle while intoxicated.
What is the fine or sentence or whatever for a youth who is caught using cannabis?
They are still determining set fines.
Mm-hmm.
We know what the offenses will be. However, the Ontario government has still come up with set fines.
Mm-hmm.
And once we know, we'll obviously... And that is also... As a police agency, again, we're responsible for enforcing. So in terms of sentencing and penalties, that's more for the courts and for the government, whereas we're just ensuring that the rules and the laws are being followed. So that information has not been released yet. However, when it is, I'll get back to you.
Awesome. Detective Bro.
Awesome.
Thank
you
you
very
so
much. Appreciate it.
Take care.